Well, we have gone over this passage. My wife sent me a text this week. Sometimes, some of you ever have your wife text you or husband text you and they're in the next room? Maybe that's a younger thing, I don't know. But she texted me this week. I was not present. She didn't know I was in the same house, but I was not present with her. And she asked me, "What's your favorite Bible verse lately?" And I had to think, because I don't know if I have a favorite lately. But one of my favorites, perhaps one of my favorite passages, more meaningful as I get older, is 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We're going to be there today because we've gone over this in various ways. We've taught through this in Sunday school before, the thorn in the flesh. If you were to really listen to what's going on out there right now, there's a lot of folks right now who would probably best be summed up by saying that they just wish all this would go away, right? And maybe you're like that too. Would you like it all to go away and just be the way it was? I a lot of times feel that way to a certain degree because there's a lot of stuff that's really hard to take in right now. And we are affected somewhat. We're not affected to the same degree perhaps as if we had lived in the heart of a city. And I'm kind of glad for that. You are probably too. We've talked about that before, that right now is probably a pretty good time to live out in the small towns of America. But you know what? God is still in control. And so while many people are going to be praying this away, hoping that it all goes away, and I've heard that, please just pray that the COVID goes away. And it's not that we don't necessarily want this to just end. Pray that all this tension goes away. And it's certainly not that we don't want this tension to end, right? Because we do. But when these kind of things happen, they reveal where people's hearts are at a lot. And when our nation's first inclinations is not to reach out to God, to have mass revival, but rather to try to find lesser ways of dealing with problems. And I'll tell you right now, that's what's going on, is lesser ways. All of the changes you see taking place in our culture right now are temporary fixes. They do not fix sin. That's the problem. They may be a tip of the hat in a sense to some of these social pressures out there, but they will not resolve the problem people truly have, which is a sin nature that must be submitted to Jesus Christ by faith in him. Without that, don't expect, even if things stop, that they've really resolved the problem, because they haven't. You can't. I'm going to talk about that later in the sermon today, but sometimes things breaking actually help us to see problems that were bigger than the ones we thought. Right? You take your car into the shop and you say, it's a little low on oil, I need it fixed, and they come out to you after you've brought it in, and they say, we have to talk to you. Your head gasket's blown and your engine is amazing that you even got here. Your car's not going to make it. You're probably going to have to get rid of this car because that engine is pretty much done. And you say, I just wanted an oil change. It was just a little bit low. Have you ever had something like that in your life? We've all kind of had that the older we get. We thought the problem was just this small thing, but it's far bigger than that. What you're seeing right now in your world is problems that are drawing out problems that already were there. They were already there. They have already been there. They are far bigger. But what is the real problem? The lack of sensitivity to the big problems. When you don't feel those big problems, you sometimes only catch sight by something else. Something smaller that does still get your attention. This would be perhaps akin to like when Nathan came to David in the Old Testament. David obviously had a lot of problems after he had done everything with Bathsheba. And he was covering it. And then he comes to him with a story of someone else's problem, which got him worked up. And then he realized, we're talking about you. We're talking about you, David. Sometimes God does that. So when you look at the problems, do you think in some sense we could call the things going on right now, even when you have to go to Walmart or whatever with all the different changes, that it's a bit of a thorn in the flesh? It is a pebble in the shoe. It is an annoyance at times. It is all things. And it's so broad of a spectrum as to how people are coming at it that I still go back to about 4 weeks ago to say that the conscience in the church is really one of the most important issues we have to address is that people have a variance of conscience, and we have to look out for the weaker brother and also the stronger brother towards different things. That, remember, it's like when it comes to weakness, it's basically being held back like a chain inside. I can only go so far, and I cannot in good conscience go further. Like a little dog, like my dog. My dog we call her the missionary dog. Have any of you seen Gracie? She is the missionary dog because she has let us have some good conversations with other people in this town when the door has been left open, and out Gracie goes, and she's all over Littleton, and she's gotten better in her older age, but still, she kind of does that. So today we're going to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 12, because the whole idea here is your perspective on the pain which you endure. It is not necessarily that this is the worst ever, the things going on, but it is oftentimes how we see it, that we think that this is terrible, God take it away, when God may have plans for it. And God has always had this as part of the plan, right? It's always been there eternally. He's known that this 2020 was coming, and it was going to look like this. This 2020 has surprised us. It has not surprised God. And so God has had intentions and plans within it as to what he is going to accomplish through it. Don't you think there are people getting saved through these times that they wouldn't have gotten saved had it not been for fears of what's going to happen? There are people getting saved through this. There are people who are turning their lives around through this. People who have been walking away from God who have woken up through this. And you got to remember that even if that's not your story, those kind of stories do exist out there. And for those kind of reasons, it's good in one sense to have problems if problems bring people to God. So I want you to keep that in mind, because that is how Paul looks at his own problem. At first, it doesn't sound like he's talking about himself here, but you quickly pick up that he is kind of talking, about himself by 4 verses in. So let's read 2 Corinthians chapter 12, looking at verses 1 through 10. It's a guide, I think, for you and for me, in part, for how to deal with the times that you and I live in right now. It is doubtless not profitable for me to boast. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body I do not know, or whether out of the body I do not know, God knows. Such a one was caught up into the third heaven. And I know such a man, whether in the body or out of the body I do not know, God knows, how he was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words, which it is not lawful for a man to utter. Of such a one I will boast, yet of myself I will not boast, except in my infirmities. For though I might desire to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will speak the truth. But I refrain lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me to be or hears from me. And we pause there real quick, because I want to tell you that the first 6 verses here form a backdrop preceding the pain. All right? You could say today, life was good in 2019. It really had its own problems, so sometimes we forget that 2019 had problems too, that oftentimes we were praying God would take out of our lives. 2020 comes, and you say, why don't we go back to last year's problems? God has a way of allowing us to sometimes have amazing things happen to us. And in this passage, Paul has something that could really get to his head. Paul doesn't quite think that. You ever think about that for yourself? That some of these things, you say, oh, God, bless me with all these different things out there. It'd be wonderful I could have them. But God says, if you had them, what might happen to you, to the person? See, God is far more interested in the person than just the person's life. Who is living in it is far more his interest. And if your heart's not ready, if you can't handle certain things, if it's going to take you away from him, then don't be surprised that there's pain. You should not be surprised that there's pain in this world right now when you look around at it. People didn't want to live with God. They didn't want to give him worship and praise as was due him. They didn't have a closeness to him. These kind of things come up, and they draw out what's already there within them. Verses 7 and 8 present the typical place that most of us are in. And maybe it's where we're kind of at in a sense right now, and not just us, like the whole church and at large is kind of feeling this in verses 7 and 8. Lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing, really listen to verse 8, because that's where most people are with their problems. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me, remove it from my life, or remove me from its life. But remove that from me. Separate me from it, so I don't have to face it and deal with it any longer. Does God ever do that? Yes, he does. Sometimes God does it in an instant. Sometimes God does it after a while. Sometimes he doesn't, though. It's like the old saying that when you ask God, sometimes for prayer requests, sometimes he says what? He says, yes. Sometimes he says no. And sometimes he says, wait. And the waiting is where most of us actually find ourselves with our prayers, is that we don't necessarily get them right away. Even a small amount of waiting or a long amount of waiting is very instrumental in the person you are and who you become. And so God does that. He lets us sometimes languish in our pain, and we wonder where he is. And sometimes people get angry at him. Sometimes people start blaming him. Sometimes people walk away from him. If this is what you're going to do to me, then I'm not going to give you praise, and I'm not going to give you any sacrifice anymore. I'm done with you. That can be how some people deal with it. Sometimes people just simply bury their heads in the sand, right? Let's just bury our heads in the sand of this year and hope that we just let the stuff pass over. But the best response that we can have is that we turn to God when things are difficult. Not that we bury our heads and try to ignore what's going on. Not that we try to just, pacify ourselves. But we learn the lesson of relying upon God, leaning upon him. And so the last verses of this passage are really how things change. Verse 9 says, and he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. Sufficient means what? It means enough. It means it will do. It will be enough. For my strength is made perfect in weakness. I'm not taking away the pain. I'm not taking away the problem, but I'll be with you in it. I have sometimes likened this in the past in other churches when I preached about this. Sometimes God lets us fall into the water, and he doesn't necessarily just throw us a lifesaver and pull us out. Sometimes he says, I'm going to jump in with you, and we're going to learn how to swim. We're going to learn how to swim. Because the easy thing for you would be to just get out, but you'd never learn the lessons that you have to learn unless you stay in the water and learn to swim. And so God sometimes does that. Sometimes that is an important part of, it's always an important part of your life, but a very important thing that you learn how to swim. That you learn that God is enough to get you through that he's not going to let you be crushed, though you're going to feel the pressure. So the last part of this verse says, therefore most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, in those things that cause me pain and harm. And that could be physical, actual things. Could be cancer, things like that. Or it could be metaphorical at times too. It could be in reproaches, people saying things against you, in needs. I'm needy and the needs are not met. And sometimes that happens. In persecutions, being attacked, in distresses. Today we don't tend to use the word distress. What do we use? It's a word that comes from it. Stress. Have you ever heard the word stressed in your culture? Have you ever said that? Of course you have. We are constantly stressed. Constantly. And if you were biblical, you'd say constantly distressed. Okay? But stress is a big problem. And really, that takes us back to, are you going to carry that? Or are you going to put that burden upon the Lord and have him help you carry that with you? Sometimes the stress we carry is unnecessary. Oftentimes it is. It's not that we get rid of the burden, but the weight we carry with it, of carrying it alone, is often the problem. And so we see your infirmities, reproaches, needs, persecutions, distresses for Christ's sake. Isn't that really the capstone to that? It helps us to see that the reason I go through these things is for Jesus, not just for my own sake alone, but for him to be glorified through my life, for me to be made more like him in the process, for me to be drawn closer to him, which I needed. How many of you, if I was to ask you today, would like to be broken? How many of you would like to be deeply broken this year? Nobody ever raises their hand to that one. Nobody wants that. Now, if I said, how many of you would like to grow deeply in patience this year? Would you raise your hand to that? And if you really thought about the question, you'd say, I think I'll pass on patience. You know why? Because what does it take to become patient? Pain and difficulty and things you don't like. We want to be more like Jesus, but we often don't want to take the path it takes to get there. That's the problem. And so he doesn't really ask us whether or not we want to take that path, does he? But he asks us whether we want to follow him. And also, if we'd like to be forgiven, and if we'd like a hope in heaven with him. But sometimes we don't quite get to determine the pains that we endure, do we? They come. But it's not about the pain. It is about what the pain produces. Like James says, it's when pain, it has its work in you, it produces patience. And that is a virtue. So verses 7 and 8 showed us the anguish that is typical of a person who is facing a thorn in their life of any sort. It could be a literal thorn at times, but generally it's not, right? Generally it's a person, it's a problem, it's a job thing, it's all sorts of stuff. It is physical at times for us. Okay, I will tell you once again that when I read the New Testament, my general consensus I get towards what is Paul's actual thorn he's referring to is his vision. It is the one thing that he relates to more than anything. He says he writes these letters, but he doesn't actually write them. And at the end, he signs it and he says, see with what large letters I write to you. Why is that? They would tell that he couldn't see in that. Paul had vision things where he saw Jesus. What happened after he saw Jesus on the road as he was walking? His eyes, he got a vision problem. He got scales on them, and then they went away when he got to the city. But you'll see throughout Paul's New Testament experience that his vision is often a thing that comes up about him. And you would say, well, how can you, and my sister-in-law, we talked about this to her the other day, she said, how in the world could you say that's a messenger of Satan? It's just a vision problem. It's not necessarily the problem itself. It's what Satan does with the problem in questioning you about, does God love you? If God loved you, you wouldn't have these things. So let me say 7 things today to help you understanding your own problems right now, whatever you're facing. And you know what? We all are facing something national on many levels. It seems like it just keeps enveloping, doesn't it? It just keeps developing. Every week, there's some new problem raising, and it does get frustrating. Well, first of all is this. A thorn in the flesh is a perspective on difficulty. It is a perspective on difficulty. It's not necessarily the difficulty itself. It's how one sees the things they're going through. It is something in my side that's making my life not pleasant. And I would say that to you because the way that he talks about this thorn of flesh changes by the end of this passage, doesn't it? All of a sudden he says, I will rather boast in my thorn, basically. Because it's not necessarily the problem of the thorn, though it is a problem, but it's how he looks at his thorn and how he relates to it. And how does he relate to that thorn? Well, he says it synonymously in that verse 7. A thorn in the flesh is given to me, and synonymously he says, a messenger of Satan. Almost one is the same. They're almost one and the same, right? The same things that Satan uses to cause us to panic and to doubt our relationship with God are the very same things that God can speak grace to us through and say, you are weak, and I am entirely sovereign over that. How do we know that? Because God says, I'm not taking it away. I'm not taking that thorn away, because why is that? Ultimately, he's the one who allowed the thorn to be there, because ultimately he wanted the thorn to be there for its purposes. You would have walked away. You would have let this get to your head. You would have thought so highly of yourself that you might have walked away from me. That's why the thorn's there. Yes, a messenger of Satan. Yes, it's difficult. But who is in control of that thorn being there at all, or Satan attacking, using it? God is. How do we relate that to our own lives? Well, the answer is that sometimes God allows some of these prayer requests we have come up because he wants those prayer requests to be there. He wants those pains to be there, unfixed at the time, because of what they're going to do to you. You don't know where you would go if you had no problems. You don't know how you would relate to that. And God does. God knows your potential. Number 3, God knows my potential. This is why he sometimes restrains me or you from keeping us from going places that would destroy who we are. He knows your potential, not just the potential that he can create in you towards good, but also your potential, if left to yourself, for letting, for instance, your head get away, expanding as it does, and thinking too highly of yourself. And he is not in the business of letting his children just continue on in their sin. So God gave him this vision, and then God let the thorn come on top of it so that he would not get so puffed up by the blessing he had been given. There are times where those prayer requests need to be unanswered for the time being. None of us likes to hear that, but it's true. Sometimes some prayer requests need to be unanswered for a season, for what they're going to change about who you are. You would not change if they got fixed right away. You would just be who you were, just without that problem. And so we need that. But none of us wants to say, well, I'll keep mine, right? Nobody ever wants to do that. But the truth is that sometimes God lets them stay to change, to bring us back down to earth, to keep us close to him. And that is very important. How many people, because of incredible physical problems, have turned to God finally after years of not, right? How many people cry out to God when the job is going under and the car is not working and so forth? The rains aren't coming for the farmers, all that. How many people actually start calling out to God in those moments? You see, what they think is the problem is not really the problem. The problem is that they haven't been doing that all along, and now they're finally doing it. They think the problem is the lack of rain. They think the problem is the physical problem. The problem is that they did not have room for him for a long time. So consider it like that God can use difficulty to bring us into the right place with him. Number 4 this morning is removing the thorn is a perspective on a need. God, I need this thorn removed. You don't understand, God. This should not be there. I need it removed. I need this problem fixed. And God says, maybe you need fixed. Maybe the problem isn't the problem. Maybe there's a lot more inside of you that needs to be fixed, and you don't want to see it. People have a hard time sometimes looking in the mirror, don't they? You ever have that? Sometimes I walk past the mirror and try not to look. Right? People don't like seeing who they are all the time. All of us can struggle with that because of what we see. We don't like all that we see. We don't like seeing that we still have an anger problem, for instance. We think we don't, and then something happens, and we don't want to see that, yeah, you do. You have an impatience problem. Well, I don't have that. I'm not like that. And something happens, and you refuse to think that you've got the issue. And so removing the thorn is a perspective on need. How I see life and what I expect often form what I think I need. I have expectations, and maybe my expectations are completely off base. But those false expectations are going to start making me see my problems as something that need to be removed. But you see, we're being made for a place beyond this. We're being made for heaven, not for this. If you're being made for that, there's a lot of changes and fixes that have to be done along the way, and problems will come. So 2020 is no accident. It comes because God has plans for it. He reveals much about people through these kind of things. But as I said, no one ever seems to think that they need to be broken. But needing humility is hard to ask for because of what it takes to get it. Difficulty, let me say this to you this morning, difficulty gets people's attention in ways that ease never does, right? An easy day does not get your attention. You enjoy it, but it doesn't wake you up. It doesn't slap you upside the head. But a difficult day does. And difficult times do. They wake you up and they make you see, they make you think. That's what God does. And don't you think our nation and our world need his attention right now? They need to give him their attention? Absolutely. Don't look at this as all bad. That's all I'm telling you today, is don't look at it as all bad. Don't look at it as though we wish it would go away. You wish it away, and you'll wish a lot of change away too in the process. You wish that away, and you'll wish away a lot of change that may need to take place that we cannot always see. Problems that we don't carry in other people's lives that may need to be addressed, that won't be addressed without some of these difficulties happening. Number 5 is that God's grace has to be seen without limitations. Without limitations. All right? A lot of people look at the grace of God and they say, the grace of God for me would be that the problem, the thorn, would leave, right? That's because they think of God's grace only as good things happening to them. And I would challenge you today to think that God's grace oftentimes also means great problems. The grace of God we think if God was gracious to me, he'd take it out. Sometimes if God was gracious to you, he'd put it in. He'd put it in because that's grace too, to change you from who you are, to not let you go on the way you are. And so grace has to be seen without limitations. One of those things that atheists often say about God, we just can't believe in a God who would allow evil in this world. And I always think about that kind of statement and think, then your view of God is too small, because God can allow evil in this world. And he doesn't have to author it, but he can allow it, because evil is not necessarily a cause of him. He didn't make people sin against him. But when you see it, it's revealing the sin that's there. One of the best tracks a person has is a mirror. You know that? One of the best tracks a person could have towards why should you believe in Jesus is just a mirror. All right? Because seeing themselves should make them see how broken they are, how much they need him, how much they can't fix who they are without him. It is a great mirror, a great tract itself. But here's the thing, that God is in control of these problems. And what we see in this passage is that God gives us grace to help us endure whatever we have to transform us. It's usually not about the problems, is the point. All right? It's not the first thing that you think of is the problem, is really the thing to be addressed. God allows them to happen to address people, to get people's attention. Number 6, weakness is a door of opportunity. See it as that. It is a door of opportunity. When you are weakened, when you cannot completely do it on your own, in your own strength, when life is hard, and it can be physical, it can be emotional, it can be anything. When God allows you to have those weaknesses, he is giving you an opportunity to do something, and that is to reach out to him more. Over the last few months, the Psalms have meant to me way more than they ever did in years past. And that is because I needed him all the more. You'll have that. You need that. And so weakness is a door of opportunity to learn things about God that I didn't know before. Weakness is an opportunity for me to come into a deeper relationship with God than I ever had. And oftentimes we don't want that weakness, but would you like the relationship with God to grow? Sometimes the only way to get there is to have those problems. Pushing against limitations, old or new, can be used to help us rely on God more and realize his strength in ways that we never do. That's why Paul says in this passage, when God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, I'm not taking away, but I'll be with you through it. My perspective on how bad this was, on why I wish these things would go away, changed, didn't it? And it changed to I rejoice in the things I used to pray would leave. I rejoice in those things. Not that I enjoy those things necessarily, but I enjoy what they produce. That's what he's saying. I enjoy the fact that my limitations, my struggles, the distresses of life make me have to be close with God. And it's that relationship that he's really rejoicing in, not necessarily just the pain itself. Because nobody just rejoices in pain alone, unless they're sadistic or something. But they don't really rejoice in pain. They rejoice in what the pain produces, like working out or anything of that nature. You cannot have the gain without the pain, right? And so this is what God does. Weakness is a door of opportunity. Lastly, number 7 today is this: peace, joy. They come from seeing what we once thought were problems as solutions to problems that we couldn't see before. See where the joy, the peace comes? It's because the thorn wasn't really the problem to him anymore. Now he saw the thorn as a thing that gave him a greater relationship with God. You can think of many different people probably, as I say that, throughout history. I think of like Johnny Erickson Tada, the lady who was completely paralyzed, neck down, and how that, for most people, would be the end of life for them. For that woman, it became a source of her closeness with God. And so for all of us, well, we don't all have that same kind of story. We definitely have these things in our lives that have actually been the places where we've had to rely upon God more, where we've grown to turn to his word more, where we feel hopeless without him, where distress is only going to be there as long as we're not reaching out to him. Those things can be a place of peace. And so in some ways, you could say that 2020 could be one of the greatest things to happen to some people's lives. Don't you think? It could be the best thing that's ever happened to some people's relationship with God. It's 2020. The very thing everybody's praying against is the very thing that to some, hopefully for many, will be the time where they grow closer to God in ways they never were close before. And so, should you pray that these things go away? Yeah, I do think you should, okay? I do think you should pray that the sickness is dealt with. I do think you should pray that these tensions are going to go away. But you should also realize that as long as God allows them to be, he has a plan and purpose for why he does. And what he may produce through that is probably going to be better than what you and I ever prayed for, right? We're just praying for a sickness to go away, and we fail to see of all the people that may be saved. And you think, did I even pray for people to be saved? Did I even pray for people to go close with God? Did I even pray for some dad who his family's been praying for him for years? The mom and kids are saved, but dad's not. Did I ever thought about those things being places where this might actually open up that door? You never know what God can do. So I would encourage you to not see it as negative. Oh, this is the worst ever. But see it as this is an opportunity, and God is at work, and we don't know all that he's doing, but we know that he's in control of it. And you know what? If you really believe the Bible, you can say today, if God wanted this all to be gone like that, don't you think it would? In a second, it'd be gone. It would be an old memory in a second if he wanted it to be. But that's not his plans. He is more about people and not just about how their lives are easy. Paul's story here, and maybe it's your story too, as we close today, is this: I'm great runs into I'm beaten down. Sometimes we're like a balloon that's starting to lift off. We feel good, everything's going well, and all of a sudden here comes the pin to pop it, and we get deflated by something. And it drives Paul to seek God's help, who in turn sets Paul's mind straight about a grace he already had access to every day. You see, Paul didn't get grace that day. He had that grace always available to him. And so do you and I, if we're believers. But we may not lean into it, and we may not even think that it's needed, but it is. And sometimes the pain makes you go right back to the place you should have been all along. So I want you to keep that in mind. I've had a handful now of different messages about this, but there are perspectives going on right now about what's going on. There are good ones, there are bad ones. There's a lot of ones that are not biblical being broadcast out there. But as believers today, I want you to take heart that it's not all bad. I want you to take heart that God is in control and that God can actually do a lot of great things through this. So pray for that. Pray that God would do a lot of work in this world. Let's close in prayer. Father, we thank you for the time we could spend in your word today. And I pray, Lord, that you would just encourage us to continue to keep our eyes on you. Help us, Lord, to see our problems as opportunities as well. We often don't see them that way, God, but I pray that you would just help us to grow, to rely upon you more, and to rejoice in you more too, and to do that in front of others. And so I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.